The October wind carried the scent of rotting leaves and something else, something copper and wrong, through the skeletal trees of Briar Creek. Sarah Whitmore pressed her hand against the rough bark of an oak tree, her breath coming in short gasps as she watched the torchlight procession wind its way up the mountain path. 27 men, their faces hidden behind crude cloth masks, marching toward the Harlow farmstead with the deliberate purpose of executioners. She had tried to warn them. God knew she had tried. The year was 1828. And Andrew Jackson's promises of democracy for the common man rang hollow in these Tennessee hills where different laws applied, laws written not in courthouses but in the smoke-filled back rooms of the town's self-appointed guardians. Sarah had lived in Briar Creek her entire 23 years, long enough to know that some secrets festered in the mountain soil, like infection in a wound, and some families carried darkness in their blood that no amount of prayer could cleanse. But the Harlow twins were different. They had to be. 3 months earlier, on a sweltering July morning, Sarah had encountered Eliza and Eleanor Harlow at the creek, where it widened into a natural pool. The twins were 17, identical in every visible way, with hair the color of corn silk and eyes like winter ice. They moved in perfect synchronization, their steps matching, their heads turning at precisely the same moment to acknowledge Sarah's presence. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," they said in unison, their voices creating an eerie harmony that raised gooseflesh on Sarah's arms despite the heat. "Morning," Sarah replied, clutching her washing basket tighter. "You startled me is all. Didn't expect anyone else up this early." Eliza, or perhaps Eleanor, tilted her head with a curious bird-like motion that her sister immediately mirrored. "We come every morning," one said. "Before the sun gets too high," the other continued. "Father doesn't like us in town." People stare. Sarah forced a smile, remembering the whispers that had circulated since the Harlow family arrived in Briar Creek 5 years prior. Thomas Harlow, a widower from Virginia, had purchased the old Mackenzie property with gold coins that he counted out slowly, deliberately, making sure every witness saw his wealth. He kept to himself, venturing into town only for supplies, his daughters always at his side, always moving in that unsettling tandem. "Folks stare at anything different," Sarah said carefully. "Doesn't mean anything by it." The twins exchanged a glance, communicating something wordless and complete. Then Eleanor, Sarah was almost certain it was Eleanor, stepped closer. "You're kind, Miss Whitmore. Father says kindness is rare. Most people in Briar Creek are afraid." "Afraid of what?" Sarah asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "Of what they don't understand," Eliza replied. And there was something ancient and knowing in those young eyes that made Sarah's stomach clench. Of what happens when two souls are born into a space meant for one. Before Sarah could respond, both girls turned and walked away, their bare feet making no sound on the rocky creek bed, their movements so perfectly synchronized they seemed less like two people and more like a reflection given life. That night, Sarah's father, Dr. Henry Whitmore, returned from the Harlow farm with his medical bag unopened and his face the color of old parchment. He poured himself a generous measure of whiskey, something Sarah had never seen him do, and sat at their kitchen table without speaking for nearly an hour. "Father?" Sarah finally ventured. "What happened at the Harlows?" Henry Whitmore was a man of science. Educated at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the few physicians in eastern Tennessee with formal training. He prided himself on rational thought, on observable phenomena, on the measurable workings of the human body. But when he looked at Sarah that night, his eyes held something she'd never seen before, pure, unreasoning terror. "Thomas Harlow called me because one of the girls had a fever," he said slowly, his voice hollow. "Simple enough, probably nothing more than summer ague, but when I examined Eliza, when I placed my stethoscope against her chest..." He paused, taking another drink. Eleanor, who was sitting across the room, she cried out at the exact moment I pressed the cold metal against her sister's skin. She felt it, Sarah, as clearly as if I'd touched her instead. Perhaps she was just startled by her sister's reaction, Sarah suggested, though her hands had gone cold. That's what I told myself, her father continued, so I tested it. I pinched Eliza's arm, hard enough to leave a mark. Eleanor screamed. I pressed a pin against Eleanor's finger, and Eliza jerked her hand away, though I was on the other side of the room. They feel each other's pain. Sarah, not through sympathy or imagination. They physically experience what the other experiences. That's impossible. I would have said the same thing this morning, her father replied. But I witnessed it. Thomas Harlow explained that it's been this way since birth. The midwife in Virginia who delivered them refused to speak of it afterward, left the state entirely. The twins, they're connected in some way that defies medical explanation. Thomas believes they share not just a womb bond, but something deeper. A single consciousness split between two bodies. Sarah sat down heavily. That's why he keeps them isolated. Partly, her father agreed, but there's more. Thomas confided something to me, made me swear on my life never to reveal it. But you're my daughter, and if something happens to me, someone needs to know the truth. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The twins aren't just connected physically. Their minds, their very souls, seem intertwined in ways that Thomas himself doesn't fully understand. He's kept detailed journals since they were infants. When one learns something, the other knows it instantly, even if they're in separate rooms. When one dreams, the other experiences the same visions. And their thoughts, Sarah, they can hear each other's thoughts as clearly as if they were spoken aloud. You can't possibly believe that. I didn't want to, her father said. But Thomas proved it to me. He had me write a message and show it only to Eleanor, making sure Eliza couldn't possibly see it. Then I asked Eliza to tell me what I'd written. She recited it word for word. We repeated the experiment 12 times with increasing complexity. Every time, perfect accuracy. These girls, they exist as two parts of a whole, and that whole is something I don't think mankind was meant to encounter. The weight of this revelation settled over Sarah like a burial shroud. She thought of the twins' synchronous movements, their shared sentences, the way they seemed to know things without speaking. It wasn't supernatural, she told herself firmly. It couldn't be. There had to be a rational explanation. Some rare medical condition that science simply hadn't categorized yet. But even as she tried to convince herself, she remembered the look in their eyes by the creek, that knowing quality that suggested they saw far more than they should, understood things that should have remained hidden. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. Her father's hand shook as he set down his glass. "Because Thomas Harlow is a desperate man sitting on a powder keg. He's wealthy, yes, but that wealth came from sources he won't discuss. And he's terrified that if the truth about his daughters becomes known, this town will destroy them. He asked me to promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd protect the girls, help them escape to somewhere safer. I gave him my word, Sarah, but I'm not a young man anymore, and my word may not be enough." 3 days after that conversation, Thomas Harlow was found dead in his barn, hanging from a rafter beam. The official verdict was suicide, delivered with unseemly haste by Mayor Josiah Blackwood and his inner circle. No investigation was conducted, no questions asked about the bruising on Thomas's knuckles that suggested a struggle, or the boot prints in the dust that clearly belonged to more than one person. The town seized Thomas Harlow's property under an obscure law claiming unpaid debts that Thomas's meticulous financial records showed had been paid in full. His considerable wealth, The gold and silver he'd kept in a reinforced strongbox vanished into the mayor's vault, redistributed among Briar Creek's founding families as recompense for some unnamed grievance. And the twins, suddenly orphaned and penniless, were taken in by the Blackwood household, not as guests, but as something far less defined, their status hovering uncomfortably between servant and prisoner. Sarah had watched all of this unfold with growing horror, recognizing the calculated precision of it, the way the mayor and his associates had orchestrated Thomas Harlowe's destruction. She'd lie awake at night, her mind racing with the injustice of it all, feeling complicit in her silence, even as she understood the danger of speaking out. The weight of that moral compromise pressed on her chest like a physical burden, making it hard to breathe, hard to pretend that everything was normal in a town built on secrets and blood. She'd tried to speak out at the town meeting, tried to question the convenient narrative of suicide, but her father had gripped her arm painfully tight and shaken his head in warning. Later, in the privacy of their home, he'd explained the reality of Briar Creek's power structure. The 27 families who'd settled this valley 3 decades prior had established their own form of governance, one that superseded state law and federal authority. They called themselves the Keepers, dedicated to preserving the moral purity and traditional values of their community. In practice, they were judge, jury, and executioner, answerable to no one, their decisions absolute. Thomas Harlowe, as an outsider with unexplained wealth and strange daughters, had been tolerated only so long as he remained useful. Once his daughters came of age, once the questions about their unusual bond became impossible to ignore, the Keepers had moved with ruthless efficiency to eliminate the problem. "But they're just girls," Sarah had protested. "Unusual, yes, but harmless." Her father's expression had been bleak. "The Keepers don't see it that way. To them, the twins represent a threat to the natural order, proof that God's design can be corrupted. They believe the girls are abominations, and there's talk, Sarah, terrible talk about what should be done to cleanse our community of this stain." That had been 2 months ago. Since then, Sarah had watched the twins deteriorate in the Blackwood household, a slow-motion tragedy that she witnessed with growing despair and rage. They were fed barely enough to survive, scraps that wouldn't be considered fit for dogs, given the most menial and degrading tasks designed to break their spirits. And worst of all, they were being systematically separated, their connections severed like a surgeon's knife through living tissue. Mayor Blackwood had decreed that their unnatural bond needed to be broken, that spending time apart would force them to develop individual identities and cure them of their shared consciousness, as if their very existence was a disease requiring treatment. The result was devastating. Kept in separate rooms, allowed to see each other only at meals under strict supervision, the twins had begun to fade like flowers deprived of sunlight. Their skin took on a greyish pallor, their eyes grew dull and unfocused, and they moved with the jerky, disjointed motions of marionettes with tangled strings. The synchronization that had once defined them fractured into chaotic discord, each twin moving at slightly different rhythms, their faces contorting with confusion and pain. Sarah had visited the Blackwood house under the pretense of delivering preserves from her father's garden, and what she witnessed made her physically ill. Eliza, hauling water from the well, suddenly collapsed as if struck by an invisible blow. Eleanor, scrubbing floors in another part of the house, had screamed at the same instant, her body convulsing with sympathetic pain. Mrs. Blackwood had beaten both girls for their disruption, adding physical suffering to their psychological torment. "Please," Eliza had whispered when Sarah managed a moment alone with her. "Please help us. We're dying. When they keep us apart, it's like being slowly torn in half. Can you feel it, Miss Whitmore? Can you imagine what it's like to be incomplete, to have half your soul locked away where you can't reach it?" Sarah had wanted to help, desperately, but she was one woman in a town controlled by men who saw compassion as weakness and difference as sin. Her father had contacts in Nashville, friends who might offer sanctuary, but getting the twins away from the Blackwood house seemed impossible. The mayor kept them under constant surveillance, and any attempt to interfere would bring the full weight of the keeper's judgment down on Sarah's family. Then, last week, everything had changed. Sarah had been in town when she heard the screaming. She'd run toward the sound along with a dozen other curious townsfolk, arriving at the Blackwood house to find Eleanor collapsed on the front porch, her body rigid with seizures, foam flecking her lips. Inside, Eliza was experiencing identical symptoms, the two girls locked in perfect synchronous suffering despite being in different rooms. Dr. Whitmore had been summoned, but there was nothing he could do. The seizures weren't physical in origin, he'd explained to the growing crowd. They were psychological, the result of forced separation between two beings that were never meant to exist independently. He'd begged Mayor Blackwood to allow the girls to be together, to ease their suffering, but the mayor had refused. "If they die, it's God's will," Blackwood had declared. "If they survive, perhaps they'll learn to live as individuals, as the Lord intended." But they hadn't died, and they hadn't adapted. Instead, something far stranger had occurred. The seizures had stopped after 3 hours, both girls falling into a deep, death-like sleep. When they woke the following morning, they seemed transformed. The confusion and pain that had marked their faces for weeks was gone, replaced by an expression of serene clarity. They moved again in perfect synchronization, but there was something different about it now, something that sent ice water through Sarah's veins when she saw them in church that Sunday. They looked at Mayor Blackwood with eyes that held no fear, only patient, terrible knowledge. And when he'd met their gaze, he'd stumbled backward, his face draining of color, one hand clutching at his chest as if his heart had suddenly seized. "What did you do?" he'd whispered. The twins had smiled, identical expressions of quiet triumph. "We understand now," they'd said in perfect unison. "We see what you are, what you've all done, the secrets you keep in the dark, the graves you've hidden, the freedom you've stolen from those who trusted you." Blackwood had fled the church, and within an hour, the keepers had convened an emergency meeting. By evening, the decision had been made. The twins were to be executed, burned as witches, their unnatural existence purged from Briar Creek before they could corrupt the entire community with their evil influence. The keepers had tried to dress it up in legal language, claiming the girls had confessed to communing with dark forces. But Sarah knew the truth. The twins had somehow learned something, discovered secrets that the town's founding families had killed to protect. And now they were paying the price for that knowledge. Which brought Sarah to this moment, hidden in the woods, watching the torchlight procession climb toward the Harlow farmstead where the twins were being held. Her father had tried to stop this, had argued passionately at the keepers' meeting that the girls were innocent, that their condition was medical rather than supernatural. For his trouble, he'd been barred from practicing medicine in Briar Creek, his 40 years of service dismissed in an instant. "Let it go, daughter," he told Sarah that afternoon, his spirit broken. "We can't fight the entire town. The twins are already lost." But Sarah couldn't let it go. She'd seen too much, understood too clearly what this moment represented. It wasn't about the twins anymore, not really. It was about power and control, about a small group of men deciding who lived and who died based on their own fear and prejudice. It was about the corruption of justice, the perversion of community into tyranny. It was about freedom and what people would sacrifice to keep others from having it. Sarah broke from the tree line and ran, following a path she'd known since childhood, racing the procession up the mountain. She reached the Harlow farmstead 10 minutes before the mob, gasping for breath, her dress torn by thorns and brambles. The twins were in the barn, chained to support posts, their wrists rubbed raw from struggling. They looked up as Sarah burst through the door, and for a moment she saw fear in their eyes, the simple human terror of children facing death. "Miss Whitmore," Eleanor breathed. "You came," Eliza added. "I'm getting you out," Sarah said, pulling a hammer and chisel from her coat. She'd stolen them from her father's workshop, along with his pistol, which now hung heavy in her other pocket. "We don't have much time." She worked frantically at the chains, the sound of metal on metal ringing through the barn. The twins watched her with an intensity that was almost physical, their eyes tracking her movements with perfect synchronization. "Why are you helping us?" they asked together. Sarah paused, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Because what they're doing is wrong. Because you're human beings, not monsters, no matter what makes you different. Because in this country, we're supposed to have the right to life and liberty, and that can't mean anything if we only apply it to people who fit someone else's definition of normal." The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications. Then Eleanor spoke alone, her voice carrying a weight beyond her years. "You understand what this will cost you. Your father has already lost his position. If you free us, they'll brand you a heretic, an enemy of the community. You'll lose everything." "I know," Sarah replied, redoubling her efforts. The chain was weakening, the bolt bending under repeated strikes. "But some things matter more than comfort or acceptance. Some things are worth fighting for, even if you fight alone." "You're not alone," Eliza said softly. "Not anymore." The chain broke with a sharp crack. Sarah immediately moved to the second post, aware that the sound of approaching voices was growing louder. The mob was close now, perhaps 5 minutes away. She attacked the second chain with desperate strength, her hands bleeding where the hammer handle had rubbed blisters. "There's something you should know," Eleanor said as Sarah worked. "The reason Mayor Blackwood and the Keepers fear us so much, it's not just because we're different. We can see things," Eliza continued, "not the future, not visions or prophecies, but connections, patterns, the truth that people hide. When we're together, when our minds are fully joined, we perceive the world differently than others. We see the relationships between events, the hidden causes behind observable effects." 3 days ago, during the seizures, something happened, Eleanor explained. "The walls in our minds, the ones that kept us from being overwhelmed by each other's thoughts, they broke down completely. For several hours, we were one consciousness in 2 bodies, seeing through 4 eyes, hearing through 4 ears, and we saw Briar Creek's history laid bare. We saw what the Keepers did 30 years ago," Eliza said. "The native families who lived in this valley before the first settlers arrived. 43 men, women and children killed in a single night. Their bodies thrown into a ravine at the head of the creek. They claimed this land through murder, then built their righteous community on unmarked graves." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment. "Dear God." "That's not all," Eleanor continued. "We saw the indentured families they worked to death in the first winters, the evidence they buried, the records they falsified. We saw the women accused of adultery and drowned in the creek, the free black man who tried to settle here and was found hanging from a tree. We saw 30 years of brutality and exploitation, all of it hidden behind church services and town meetings and proclamations about moral virtue. And Mayor Blackwood knows we know," Eliza finished. "He looked into our eyes Sunday morning, and he saw his own sins reflected back at him. That's why they've decided to kill us now, why they can't risk a trial or any process that might allow us to speak publicly. They're not burning us because we're unnatural. They're burning us because we know the truth about what they've built here, and they're terrified that truth will destroy them." The second chain broke. Sarah helped the twins to their feet, noting how they immediately moved close together, their shoulders touching, some of the color returning to their faces with proximity. "Can you ride?" Sarah asked. "We can do anything if we're together," they replied in unison. Sarah led them out the back of the barn, toward the small stable where Thomas Harlow had kept his horses. To her relief, the animals were still there, somehow overlooked in the seizure of the Harlow property. She quickly saddled 2 horses, her movements made clumsy by exhaustion and fear. The twins mounted a single horse, sitting one behind the other, their bodies perfectly aligned. Sarah took the other horse, checking her father's pistol and praying she wouldn't have to use it. "There's a pass through the mountains, about 3 miles east," Sarah said. "My father's friend in Nashville will help you. His name is Judge Marshall, and he's a good man, one who actually believes in the law. Tell him everything you know about Briar Creek. Make sure the truth comes out." "What about you?" Eleanor asked. "I'm going to slow them down," Sarah replied. Her jaw set with determination. "Give you enough time to get clear." "They'll kill you," Eliza said flatly. "Maybe," Sarah acknowledged. "But I'm not going to live in a place where people can be murdered for being different, where justice is whatever those in power say it is. Either Briar Creek changes, or I'd rather die trying to change it. That's what freedom means, doesn't it? The right to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." The twins regarded her with their strange, synchronized gaze. Then, moving as one, they dismounted and approached Sarah. Each took one of her hands, their grips surprisingly strong. "You've given us our lives back," they said together. "More than that, you've given us hope that kindness and courage still exist in this world. We'll carry your name with us, Miss Whitmore. We'll tell everyone what you did, what you risked. The truth about Briar Creek will be known, and your sacrifice won't be forgotten." Then Eleanor spoke alone. "But you don't have to die here. Come with us. There's room for 3, and together we have a better chance." Sarah was tempted, more than they knew. But she thought of her father, alone in his house, his life's work destroyed for trying to help. She thought of the other families in Briar Creek who'd seen their loved ones disappear or die under suspicious circumstances, who'd lived in fear for years. Someone had to stay, had to be a witness, had to force the keepers to confront what they'd become. "No," she said gently. "You go. Ride hard. Don't look back. I'll face them here, tell them the truth, make enough noise that people from other towns start asking questions. Even if they kill me, even if they silence every voice in Briar Creek, word will spread. Your testimony and mine, together, will be enough to bring justice." The sound of the mob was very close now, perhaps 100 yards away. Sarah could see the torchlight flickering through the trees. "Go!" she commanded. The twins mounted quickly, but before riding away, Eliza leaned down from the saddle. "One more thing, Miss Whitmore. About our connection, what makes us different. We've thought about it constantly, tried to understand it, and we believe it's not unnatural at all. We think it's a glimpse of what humanity could become, what we could be if we weren't so separated from each other, so isolated in our individual minds. Imagine a world where people could truly understand each other, where empathy wasn't just imagination, but lived experience. That's what terrifies the keepers most, not our strangeness, but the possibility we represent." Then they were gone. Galloping into the darkness, the sound of their horses' hooves fading quickly, Sarah walked to the front of the barn and stood in the yard, directly in the path of the approaching procession. She pulled out her father's pistol and held it loosely at her side, not threatening, just visible. A statement that she wouldn't be taken easily. The mob emerged from the trees, 27 men with torches and clubs, their masked faces turning the community leaders she'd known all her life into anonymous monsters. They stopped when they saw her, forming a semicircle 20 feet away. Mayor Blackwood stepped forward, pulling down his mask. His face was flushed with exertion and anger. "Sarah Whitmore, I'm disappointed but not surprised. Your father always did have too much sympathy for the unnatural and perverse. They're gone, Sarah said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard. Eliza and Eleanor Harlow. They're riding to Nashville right now to tell Judge Marshall everything they know about this town, about the murders, the theft, the corruption you've all hidden for 30 years. A murmur ran through the mob. Several men shifted uncomfortably. Those girls are disturbed, Blackwood said, though Sarah could hear the fear beneath his bluster. Anything they claim is the product of diseased minds. No one will believe them. I will corroborate their testimony, Sarah replied. My father will testify about how Thomas Harlow died, about the bruises and the boot prints that showed he was murdered. We'll present financial records proving his debts were paid, that his property was seized illegally, and we'll keep talking, keep asking questions until people from outside Briar Creek start investigating. You can kill me, Mayor, but you can't stop the truth from spreading. Blackwood's face contorted with rage. You stupid girl! Do you think the outside world cares about what happens in these mountains? We're too small, too remote. No one's coming to save you or anyone else. Maybe not, Sarah conceded, but I care. I won't live in a place that murders children because they're different, that calls tyranny community and murder justice. You've turned Briar Creek into a prison, where everyone lives in fear of saying the wrong thing, knowing the wrong person, being different in any way that threatens your control. That's not America. That's not what our grandfathers fought and died for. She raised the pistol, not pointing it at anyone, just holding it where they could see. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to let me walk down this mountain. You're going to let my father and I leave Briar Creek in peace. And you're going to pray that when the authorities finally investigate this town, they show you more mercy than you've shown your victims. For a long moment, no one moved. The torchlight cast dancing shadows across the yard, and Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She was terrified, more frightened than she'd ever been, but she was also free in a way she'd never experienced before. She'd made her choice, taken her stand, and whatever happened next, she'd done so on her own terms. Then one of the masked men stepped forward. He pulled off his hood, revealing the weathered face of Jacob Thornton, the blacksmith. Sarah had known him since childhood, had always thought him a decent man. Mayor, Thornton said slowly, maybe we should listen to her. I've been having doubts myself lately about what we've become. My grandfather helped found this town to escape persecution, to build a place where people could live free. Somewhere along the line, we became the persecutors. We became what we fled from. Be silent, Blackwood snapped. You swore an oath to the keepers to protect this community from corruption and sin. I swore to protect families, not murder children, Thornton replied. Those Harlow girls, they never hurt anyone. They were just different. And we couldn't stand that, made us question things, made us uncomfortable. So we decided to destroy them, same as we've destroyed anyone else who didn't fit our narrow definition of acceptable. Another man removed his mask, then another. Within moments, half the mob had revealed their faces, their expressions troubled, questioning. The solidarity that had seemed so absolute moments before fractured like thin ice over deep water. Mayor Blackwood looked around frantically, seeing his control slipping away. You're all fools, he snarled. Weak, sentimental fools. Those girls are abominations, and this woman is a traitor. If we don't act now, if we don't show strength, everything we've built will collapse. The outside world will come in, change our ways, destroy our traditions. Our traditions include murder, Sarah said quietly. Our traditions include tyranny. Maybe they deserve to be destroyed. Blackwood's hand moved to his belt, pulling a knife. He advanced on Sarah with terrifying speed, crossing the distance between them in seconds. Sarah raised the pistol, her hand shaking, knowing she was about to kill or be killed. The shot rang out, impossibly loud in the mountain stillness, but it wasn't Sarah who fired. Doctor. Henry Whitmore stepped from the barn, smoke still curling from his own pistol. Mayor Blackwood stumbled backward, a red stain spreading across his shoulder. The knife fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers. "That's enough, Josiah," Henry said, his voice tired but firm. "No more blood, no more secrets. This ends tonight." Blackwood clutched his shoulder, his face pale with shock and pain. "You shot me. You actually shot me." "I did," Henry agreed, "because you were about to murder my daughter, and I've stood by too long already, let too many terrible things happen, because I was afraid or complicit or both, but no more. Sarah's right. If this is what Briar Creek has become, then it's time for Briar Creek to change or die." Several of the unmasked men moved to restrain Blackwood, and Sarah felt the tension drain from her body so suddenly she almost collapsed. Her father came to her side, supporting her with one arm. "The twins?" he asked quietly. "Safe," Sarah replied. "On their way to Nashville." "Good," Henry said. "Then let's hope Judge Marshall is half the man I remember. This town needs to answer for its crimes, and those girls deserve their chance at freedom." Over the next 3 days, Briar Creek tore itself apart. The men who'd unmasked themselves formed a new council, demanding answers about the town's hidden history. The keepers' records were seized and opened, revealing decades of corruption, theft, and murder. Messages were sent to Nashville, to federal authorities, to anyone who might have jurisdiction over the crimes that had been committed in this isolated mountain community. Mayor Blackwood, recovering from his wound, tried to rally his remaining supporters, but the moral authority he'd wielded for so long had evaporated. Too many people had seen behind the curtain, recognized the tyranny they'd been living under. The promise of freedom that Andrew Jackson's election represented, the idea that common people deserved a voice in their own governance, had finally penetrated even to Briar Creek. Sarah and her father prepared to leave, knowing they'd never be truly welcome in a town that had turned against them. But before they could depart, a rider arrived from Nashville with news that changed everything. The twins had reached Judge Marshall safely and had spent 18 hours giving testimony. Marshall, outraged by what he heard, had immediately dispatched federal marshals to Briar Creek with orders to investigate every death and disappearance over the past 30 years. More than that, he'd contacted newspaper editors in Nashville, Knoxville, and even Washington, ensuring that the story of the Harlow twins and the town that tried to murder them would be known far beyond Tennessee's borders. "The girls asked me to give you this," the rider said, handing Sarah a sealed letter. She opened it with trembling hands and read, "Dear Miss Whitmore, we are safe, as you hoped, though our journey was harrowing and we feared pursuit every mile. Judge Marshall has been everything your father promised, kind and just and determined to see that truth prevails. He tells us that our testimony, combined with your father's evidence and the statements of other Briar Creek residents who've found their courage, will likely result in trials for dozens of people. Justice, real justice, may finally come to your town. But we write not to discuss legal proceedings, but to thank you for something far more precious. You gave us our lives, yes, but more than that. You showed us that people can change, can stand against injustice even when it costs them everything. You proved that freedom isn't just a word, but something worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for. We've spent our entire lives feeling like monsters, like mistakes of nature that shouldn't exist. But you saw us as human beings, deserving of dignity and rights. That gift is more valuable than you can possibly know. It's given us the courage to live openly, to stop hiding what we are, to advocate for others who are different or unusual or deemed unacceptable by society's narrow standards. Judge Marshall says we're remarkable, that our shared consciousness could teach scientists important things about human psychology and connection. He's introduced us to professors at the university who want to study us, not as specimens, but as collaborators in understanding the full spectrum of human experience. For the first time, our difference is seen as something precious rather than shameful. We hope you'll visit us in Nashville when things settle in Briar Creek. We want to know you better, to learn from your strength and conviction. And perhaps together we can work to ensure that what happened to us and to your town never happens again. That people learn to celebrate difference rather than fear it, to choose freedom over control, truth over comfortable lies. You asked if we understood what we represented, what our existence might mean. We've thought about it constantly since that night, and we believe we're proof that human consciousness is more flexible, more capable of connection than anyone realizes. Our shared mind isn't a curse or a miracle. It's simply a different way of being human, one that challenges assumptions about where one person ends and another begins. In a way, all humans share a single soul, don't they? We're all connected by our common humanity, our universal capacity for love and fear and hope. The only difference is that we experience that connection more directly, more intensely. If people could learn from us, could see past their terror of the unknown, perhaps society could become more empathetic, more willing to understand rather than condemn. That's our hope anyway, and it's a hope we wouldn't have without you. With eternal gratitude and deepest respect, Eliza and Eleanor Harlow Sarah folded the letter carefully, tears streaming down her face. Her father read over her shoulder, and she heard his sharp intake of breath at certain passages. "They're going to be all right," Henry said wonderingly. "More than all right. They're going to thrive, make something beautiful from their difference." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "And maybe Briar Creek will too. Maybe this moment, as painful as it is, will force people here to confront what they've become, to choose a better path forward." She looked out the window at the town she'd known all her life, seeing it with new eyes, the clean, orderly streets that had hidden so much rot, the church steeple that had provided moral cover for murder, the town square where justice had been perverted into tyranny for 3 decades. But she also saw Jacob Thornton, standing in front of his smithy, talking earnestly with a group of younger men, their faces animated with passion. She saw families gathering in the street, discussing the revelations, some angry, some ashamed, but all of them engaged, awake in a way they hadn't been before. Change was possible. Freedom could be fought for and won. Truth, however painful, had power that lies could never match. 3 weeks later, federal marshals arrived in Briar Creek and began their investigation. 7 of the original keepers were arrested for murder, conspiracy, and fraud. Mayor Blackwood died in custody before trial, his heart finally giving out under the weight of his crimes. The town's property records were thoroughly audited, revealing systematic theft and corruption that resulted in restitution being paid to dozens of families. The mass grave of native families was found exactly where the twins had described it, a ravine at the head of Briar Creek. The discovery made national newspapers, sparking debates about frontier justice, the treatment of indigenous peoples, and the dark foundations of many civilized communities. Briar Creek became a cautionary tale, a reminder that moral rhetoric without accountability breeds monstrous hypocrisy. Sarah's father was reinstated as the town physician with a formal apology and back pay. Many of the families who'd supported the keepers left Briar Creek entirely, unable to face the shame of their complicity. New families arrived, drawn by cheap land and the promise of building something better from the ruins of the old order. But Sarah herself left for Nashville, accepting an invitation from the twins to work with Judge Marshall's reform committee. She became an advocate for those deemed different or unacceptable, using the lessons learned in Briar Creek to fight for systemic change. Her speeches drew crowds, her testimony influenced legislation, and her name became synonymous with the idea that true freedom required the courage to defend the rights of even the most unusual and misunderstood among us. Years later, when people asked Sarah about that October night in 1828, about her decision to risk everything for 2 strange girls she barely knew, She always gave the same answer. They weren't strange. They were human beings. And they deserved what all human beings deserve, the freedom to exist without fear, to be different without persecution, to live their lives on their own terms. The fact that their difference made others uncomfortable, even frightened, doesn't diminish their humanity or their rights. The moment we start deciding who deserves freedom based on how comfortable they make us feel, we've abandoned the very principles that make freedom meaningful. And when pressed about whether she regretted anything, about whether the cost had been worth it, Sarah would smile, that same fierce, determined smile that had frightened Mayor Blackwood in his final moments. "Regret?" she'd say. "I saved 2 lives that night, yes, but more than that, I saved myself. I stopped being complicit in tyranny. I chose freedom over fear, truth over comfortable lies. And that choice, hard as it was, gave my life meaning that comfort and safety never could have. The twins taught me that difference isn't something to fear, it's something to celebrate, because it expands our understanding of what it means to be human. And that lesson, that one precious lesson, changed everything." The twins themselves thrived in Nashville, becoming minor celebrities and eventually respected researchers at the university. Their unique condition was studied extensively, leading to breakthroughs in understanding human consciousness, empathy, and the nature of identity. They married brothers, lived in adjoining houses, and raised their children in an atmosphere of love and acceptance that would have been impossible in Briar Creek. But they never forgot that October night, or the woman who'd given them their freedom. Every year on the anniversary, they would travel to Briar Creek, now transformed into a genuinely democratic community, and lay flowers on the graves of those who died under the keeper's reign. They would visit Sarah's father until his death at 83, honoring the man who'd risked his career to defend them. And they would tell their story, over and over to anyone who would listen. They spoke in schools and churches, at town halls and political rallies. They explained what it felt like to be different, to have your very existence questioned, to live in constant fear that who you are might be enough to condemn you. But they also spoke about hope, about the people like Sarah Whitmore, who chose courage over convenience, who stood up for freedom even when it cost them everything. Their message resonated especially in 1828, a time when America was grappling with fundamental questions about democracy, equality, and human rights. Andrew Jackson's presidency brought the promise of expanded suffrage and greater political participation for common people, but it also exposed deep contradictions about who counted as fully human, who deserved rights and protections. The twins became living symbols of these contradictions. Their unusual condition challenged assumptions about individuality and identity that underpinned American political philosophy. If 2 people could share consciousness, where did one end and the other begin? How did concepts like individual liberty apply? Were they one person or 2 for purposes of voting, property ownership, legal standing? These questions proved uncomfortable for many, threatening established categories and forcing people to think more deeply about what freedom actually meant. But the twins embraced the discomfort, arguing that true liberty required grappling with difficult cases, with people and situations that didn't fit neatly into existing frameworks. "Freedom isn't just for people like you," Eleanor said in a famous speech in 1835. "It's not just for those who fit comfortably into society's expectations. Real freedom, meaningful freedom, has to include the strange, the different, the uncomfortable. Because the moment you start excluding people because they make you uneasy, you've created not freedom, but simply a more comfortable form of oppression." Eliza continued, as she always did, their speeches flowing in seamless partnership. "Our sister, Sarah Whitmore, understood this in 1828, even when no one else in Briar Creek did. She recognized that defending our right to live, strange as we were, mattered not just for us, but for everyone, Because a society that murders difference is a society where no one is truly safe, where anyone could be next if they step outside increasingly narrow boundaries. The sisters' advocacy extended beyond their own unusual case. They campaigned for prison reform, arguing that incarceration should rehabilitate rather than simply punish. They spoke out against the forced removal of native peoples, pointing to the mass grave in Briar Creek as evidence of the atrocities committed in the name of civilization. And they worked tirelessly for the abolition of slavery, seeing in that institution the ultimate perversion of freedom, the reduction of human beings to property based solely on difference. This last cause brought them into conflict with many who'd supported them initially. Defending unusual white girls was one thing. Challenging the economic foundation of Southern society was quite another. The twins received death threats, saw their research funding cut, and were denounced from pulpits across Tennessee. But they persisted, drawing strength from each other and from the memory of that October night when Sarah Whitmore had stood alone against a mob. They'd learned that real change required courage, that freedom had to be fought for continuously, that comfort and safety were often the price of meaningful principle. In 1842, Eliza and Eleanor Harlow published a book titled The Divided Soul, a memoir of freedom and connection. It became an immediate bestseller, combining their personal story with philosophical reflections on consciousness, identity, and human rights. The book's final chapter, dedicated to Sarah Whitmore, ended with words that would be quoted for generations. "We were born different, born connected in ways that science still struggles to explain. For most of our young lives, we were taught to see this difference as a curse, as something shameful that needed to be hidden or cured. The town of Briar Creek tried to destroy us because our existence challenged their certainties, made them question their assumptions about how humans should be. But one woman, one brave, principled woman, looked at us and saw not monsters, but human beings. Sarah Whitmore risked her life to defend our freedom, and in doing so, she taught us the most important lesson anyone can learn: that we owe our loyalty not to comfort or convention, but to truth and justice, even when pursuing them costs us everything. This is what freedom means in America, or what it should mean. Not simply the absence of obvious chains, but the presence of genuine possibility, the right to exist as we are without fear of persecution or death. And this freedom cannot be passive. It cannot be something we simply enjoy while others suffer. Real freedom requires active defense, the willingness to stand up for those whose difference makes them vulnerable, whose strangeness invites violence. We share a single soul between two bodies, yes, but in a deeper sense, all of humanity shares a single soul, a common capacity for empathy and connection that transcends our physical separation. The tragedy of places like Briar Creek is that this shared humanity gets forgotten, buried beneath fear and prejudice and the desire for simple certainty. Sarah Whitmore remembered. She chose to see our common humanity rather than our surface difference. And that choice, repeated by millions of people making similar decisions in their own lives, is what transforms societies from prisons of conformity into communities of genuine freedom. This is our hope, that our story, strange as it is, will inspire others to make the same choice Sarah made, to defend difference rather than destroy it, to celebrate the unusual rather than fear it, to recognize that freedom worth having must be freedom for all, especially those who make us most uncomfortable. We cannot all share consciousness as Eliza and I do, but we can share commitment, shared purpose, shared determination to build a society where no one faces what we faced in Briar Creek, where no one has to choose between hiding who they are and fighting for their life, where difference is not dangerous but precious, expanding our collective understanding of what humans can be. This is Sarah Whitmore's legacy, This is the gift she gave us, and through us gave to everyone who reads these words. The knowledge that one person, acting with courage and principle, can change the world, can save lives, challenge tyranny, and light a path toward genuine freedom. We carry her with us always, her memory as vivid and present as any of our shared experiences. And we promise, as long as we live, to honor her sacrifice by continuing her work, defending the vulnerable, standing up for the different, and refusing to accept that comfort and convention should ever outweigh truth and justice. May her example inspire you as it has inspired us. May you find, in your own life, the courage to stand against mobs, to question authorities, to defend those whom society has deemed expendable. This is how freedom is maintained, through countless individual acts of moral courage, through the daily decision to see human beings rather than categories, souls rather than surfaces. And may you never forget what we learned that terrible, beautiful October night in 1828, that we are all connected, all sharing this strange experience of consciousness and existence, all deserving of the freedom to be fully, completely, authentically ourselves. That is what Sarah Whitmore fought for. That is what we fight for still. And that fight, difficult and dangerous as it is, remains the most important work any human can undertake. For in the end, freedom is not a gift we receive. It's a responsibility we embrace, a burden we carry together, a promise we make to every generation. That difference will be celebrated, that courage will be honored, and that no one will face the darkness alone. This is our story. This is our message. This is our hope for America and for humanity. May it find root in your heart as it has in ours, and may you carry it forward into whatever future awaits, keeping alive the flame that Sarah Whitmore lit in the mountains of Tennessee, the eternal fire of human dignity, connection, and freedom.